I'm going to ask that the room be cleared. We're trying to proceed with the hearing. So if we could please clear the room, I would appreciate it. I would like to have the room cleared. If somebody would like to participate regarding the hearing, if we could please clear the room. 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 Yeah, right, the witnesses can stay. If we could please clear the room. If you're here for the hearing, then please stay. If you're not, no, not now. I have a hearing.
Really is becoming.
I have a hearing.
The National Security Council made yesterday and said it's.
I need to proceed with the hearing. I need to proceed with the hearing.
And continue to. But
I'm not, please.
people dying constantly.
Please, if you could please, I need you all to leave the room. I need you all to leave the room.
Except though, Minister, you put the lights blue, so how you gonna do one thing and not talk about the other thing? You literally.
If you could please leave.
That was not okay.
I'm happy.
He did the council. He did the council.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Please. Thank you. Juan, are we ready? I'm calling to order this hearing. This is A public hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. This is the first of three hearings that we're having today on legislation pending in the Committee of the Whole. Today is Tuesday, March 12th, 2024. The time is 11:50 in the morning. This hearing is being held in the Council Chambers, Room 500 of the Johnny Wilson Building. The subject of this first hearing is Bill 25-640, entitled the Ballpark Budget and Maintenance Amendment Act of 2023. This legislation was introduced by me on December 22nd of last year. And the stated purpose of this legislation is to clarify the use of the Ballpark Revenue Fund and to establish the Ballpark Maintenance Fund. The legislation provides that any ballpark revenue fund balance remaining after bond defeasance is to be transferred to the new ballpark maintenance fund. The fund is additionally financed through the following revenue sources: sales taxes collected within the ballpark and rent paid from the lease of the ballpark. So when the stadium was built, the construction was funded through borrowing. Those bonds are expected to be paid off in full in the next few years. In the meantime, there is a ballpark revenue fund, which is where revenues are deposited to pay off the bonds. That fund would be extinguished. I will pause for a moment. So the ballpark revenue fund will be extinguished and the remaining funds will be deposited into this new ballpark maintenance fund. The legislation further requires that Events DC submit an annual report to the mayor and the council that details ballpark expenditures from the prior fiscal year and planned spending for the current fiscal year and the next 4 years. The legislation mandates beginning in fiscal year 2024, that's the current fiscal year, and annually each fiscal year until the ballpark revenue bonds are defeased, that the ballpark revenue fund can be used only to pay district obligations and that beginning in fiscal year 2024 and annually each fiscal year until the ballpark revenue fund bonds are defeased, the ballpark revenue fund can be used only to pay district obligations after Events DC has first used its funds and excess reserves to pay these costs. The legislation also prohibits use of the ballpark revenue fund to finance additional bonds. I was reading from the hearing notice that was a little bit dry. I will add this, a little bit additional flavor. As the district has seen over the last few months, the presence of existing major league sports teams is an asset to the district and something that we should support. In the case of the baseball stadium, that stadium was built by the district government and is owned by the district government, and therefore the district government has a responsibility to maintain the ballpark. There's been some uncertainty over ensuring that the ballpark is well maintained at a state of good repair, and that also there's the opportunity for the ballpark to be enhanced. We want to make sure that the ballpark is not only maintained in a state of good repair, but also that the ballpark remains competitive with other stadiums, major league stadiums across the country. So that's what this legislation is intended to do, is to ensure that there is an ongoing revenue source as well as a process to continue to maintain and improve the facility, which is owned by the district government. That's the thinking behind the legislation. Before I recognize witnesses, I'm going to recognize a colleague, Councilmember Charles Allen, who is participating virtually. Councilmember Allen, you're missing some of the excitement in the room, but if you have an opening statement, please give it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I could hear a little bit. I appreciate you moving and introducing this legislation. I'm not going to get into the particulars of the bill as proposed, but I did want to just make a comment about why this is so necessary and why I think it's really important that the district has to move forward with this. I think about 2008, which was the first season for the Nationals in the new ballpark. And let me look a little bit further to our south and think about Atlanta, Georgia, the Atlanta Braves. Their season at Turner Field began in 1997. That was the first year of the use of that ballpark for their team. And in 2013, only 16 years later, they were having conversations and made a decision ultimately to move to a new stadium and move outside of the center city. That lasted, again, that ballpark, 16 years. And part of what Atlanta looked at was the fact that the city and that partnership had not been maintaining the ballpark, whether that be seats, whether it be lighting, whether it be scoreboards, whether it be fan experience. They weren't investing in and maintaining their stadium at the required levels and in the partnership. And what ended up happening is they then built Truist Park. They moved further away and left that stadium. And I think that hurt overall their city and the economic activity that would come with the use of that ballpark. That was 16 years in one ballpark, basically. Let's think about the Nationals. Our first season at Nationals Ballpark was 2008. In a couple of weeks, they'll be starting their next season, and it will be the 16th year. This is a really pivotal time. If we look at other ballpark experiences around 15, 16 years, you either are investing in that ballpark with the maintenance that's necessary, or you have gotten to a state of deterioration of a ballpark that a new site has to be created. That would be bad for the district in so many different ways. We want to make sure that the Nationals are staying at this ballpark, and we want to make sure the city is doing their part to invest in that ballpark to keep it up, because once it reaches a certain point of deterioration, it costs a lot more money to get it back to the right level. And I think one of my concerns has been, and I appreciate working closely with the Nationals, with Events DC and others to try to get resources in, is that we have not been able to maintain what is a great ballpark and a great experience, but we have not been able to maintain it. It's not too far gone. I still think there is an opportunity, and I think this legislation lays out a pathway to be able to make sure we're making the types of investments the ballpark needs, because we do not want to find ourselves in the position of Atlanta or anywhere else where the ballpark itself now has gotten to the place of it's too expensive to do that maintenance work and to get it back in a state of good repair. And then we're looking at another location. That would be unwise for so many reasons, from an economic development perspective, from the standpoint of just land use, from the standpoint of how much work it takes to build a stadium and the environmental impacts of building a stadium. We can't find ourselves in a position of building a stadium every 15 to 20 years. We need to invest in the one that we've got. We have an economic engine that takes place in our city. We've got a team and a community around it. And so I appreciate that we're going to kind of go through the details of this legislation, Mr. Chairman, but at the end of the day, I want us to stay centered on what it is we're trying to accomplish. And that is to make sure that we are putting resources into the maintenance and improvements of this ballpark so that we never find ourselves being compared to Atlanta and what took place at Turner Field to Truist Park. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing more details about this legislation and making sure that we're keeping up our end of the bargain to invest in this space that we built to make sure it's there for a very long time. Thank you.
Let me see. I'm going to thank you, Councilmember Allen. I'm going to turn to the witnesses. And we have four. I note that we do not have, the mayor did not send a representative to speak to the executive's position. Interesting. But let me call the four witnesses. Emeka Moname, who is the president of the Capitol Riverfront Bid. Jessica Giles, who's the executive director of Education Reform Now Advocacy, and I think she's participating virtually. Gregory McCarthy, who is senior vice president for community and government engagement with the Washington Nationals Baseball Club. And Betsy Philpott, who's senior vice president and general counsel of the Washington Nationals Baseball Club. Y'all could come forward. Bit challenging, but this is important legislation, and I think it's we've seen over the years that the presence of the baseball stadium and the baseball team has been important to the district. We want to make sure that that continues into the future. The first witness is Emeka Moname. Make sure you speak into the microphone so that we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Hello? Is
Yeah,
that better?
okay.
All right. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and
you.
Councilmember Allen. My name is Emeka Moname, President of the Capitol Riverfront Business Improvement District, and I'm here to speak in support of Bill 25640, Ballpark Budget and Maintenance Amendment Act of 2023. This bill would allow taxes generated from the sale of products and services within the ballpark to be reinvested in Nationals Ballpark, a facility owned by the District of Columbia. While just 72% built out, Capitol Riverfront is already home to over 20,000 residents, provides jobs for 36,000 office workers, has 7.1 million square feet of office space, 1,400 hotel rooms, and 90 restaurants. We have over 80 stores and businesses. It boasts hundreds of free community events, 14 acres of parks and program space, and activities that support an outdoor and active lifestyle year-round. Capitol Riverfront is also home to 4 professional sports teams between Audi Field and Nationals Park. The neighborhood offers places and experiences that visitors to the district and this region seek out. Great places do not happen by accident, and district leaders, past and present, can take pride and credit for the strategic foresight and continued investments that have shaped this community. Together with leaders in the private sector, these investments have attracted residents, businesses, and visitors that have supported the economic and fiscal well-being of the district. Furthermore, these investments have helped make the neighborhood resilient. During the post-pandemic period, Capitol Riverfront was able to thrive as a job center, a residential hub, and an entertainment district, a model of a live, work, play nexus, which will generate almost $150 million in net fiscal impact in 2024 alone. Nationals Park stands as one of the most consequential catalytic investments made in Capitol Riverfront over the past 20 years. In fact, the Capitol Riverfront bid was created just 6 months before the ballpark opened in 2008, I'm sorry. Since that time, district residents and visitors throughout the region have been coming in droves to the waterfront. Capitol Riverfront hosted over 3.2 million hospitality visitors during 2023, driven by our growing sports and entertainment economy. A 2020 study estimated that incremental tax revenue accruing to the city on game days alone, inside and around the ballpark, is as much as $40 million annually. The study also estimated that establishments in the area surrounding the ballpark earn 60% of their sales on Nationals Park event days. We at the Capitol Riverfront Bend have been also fortunate to see firsthand how Nationals Park has served the community beyond game days and tax revenue. For example, the ballpark has served as a meal prep and distribution location for DC Central Kitchen during the COVID-19 pandemic. It served as an election polling place and also a reunification center following the tragic 2013 Navy Yard shooting incident. So in addition to being an entertainment asset, which clearly is, it can also be seen and flexed as a civic and community asset. It's for these reasons that the Capitol Riverfront Business Improvement District supports this amendment. The continued attractiveness and competitiveness of Nationals Park as Councilmember Allen spoke to, as an entertainment venue and sports destination is an essential part of the visitor experience and economic vitality of the Capital Riverfront and the District of Columbia more broadly. The investments envisioned and proposed in this bill will allow the Nationals to continue attracting and accommodating top-level events, driving dollars into local businesses, and contributing to the social fabric of our city. Before I finish, I think it's also important to highlight the need for continued care and investment in the public realm. And Chairman Mendelson, we spoke about this previously. The open space and streetscape around the entertainment assets in Capital Riverfront. While not the subject of this piece of legislation, the investments made by the district as part of the development of Nationals Park and Audi Field for that matter, in infrastructure, transportation management, and public spaces are also in need of attention to ensure that they, like Nationals Park, continue to be to make this area a destination attractive and competitive. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Monime. Jessica Giles, who's participating virtually.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson, Councilmember Allen, members and staff of the Committee of the Whole. My name is Jessica Giles. I'm a Ward 7 resident and the Executive Director of the DC chapter of Education Reform Now Advocacy, an organization fighting for a just and equitable public education system for all students. At ERNA, we always put students first and focus on improving student attendance, literacy, math, and secondary pathways to college and career. Today, I'm pleased to present testimony regarding B25-0640. This legislation creates a long-term partnership with the Nationals, which is laudable. I've been a fan for many years, going to baseball games, and I even once lived near the park. So I appreciate its contributions to the district. However, I believe the team can do more to help foster career opportunities for DC residents. Now is the perfect time for the DC Council to work with the Washington Nationals to create an employment program like the one initially proposed in the NATS enabling legislation in 2005. A great example of this program is already in the deal negotiated with DC United at Audi Field. I'm including more information about this partnership in my written testimony as an example. We can imagine that the employment program would incorporate a training program in sports management and field maintenance or other vital parts of the Major League Baseball experience. DC residents could then apply to be part of the program, begin to get the essential work experience it takes to get on the path to a stable, well-paid career. Obviously, a program like this would benefit the residents who can enroll, but it would also benefit the Nationals. The team would have a steady stream of DC residents who are career ready, trained on the job, and willing to support the team. I'm bringing this issue to your attention because DC as a whole needs to do more to prepare our young folks for college and career. Currently, only 18 out of 100 ninth graders in DC's 2011 through 12 cohort completed a post-secondary degree within 6 years of high school graduation. And we're seeing disparities between how much DC residents make as compared to transplants, $31,000 versus $58,000 for residents 18 to 34 years of age. With the legislation before us, we can make a better proposal by including this community benefit and ensuring DC residents earn a livable wage. Let's envision a future with DC resident at its core, where we are cheering on our favorite players and those pursuing careers that enable us to continue enjoying America's favorite pastime. Thank you for letting me testify today. I'm available to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Giles. Gregory McCarthy.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Councilmember Allen. I'm Gregory McCarthy, Senior Vice President at the Washington Nationals. I'm joined here by my colleague, Betsy Philpott, our General Counsel. I have a testimony that I'll submit for the record and just summarize it with a couple of comments that we want to convey to you. We're very pleased that the council is focusing on the city's ballpark and ways to ensure that the ballpark remains a success for the city. You've heard from Mr. Monime about the economic impact of the ballpark and the Capital Riverfront neighborhood and the city overall. One has to only look around the ballpark to gauge a tremendous economic vitality that now exists, with lots of incremental revenues to the general fund, providing critical resources for the city. It's been widely reported that the sports and entertainment industries are absolutely vital to the city's economic future. It's also clear that these industries are very competitive and that customers have many options and the facilities have to remain in great shape and otherwise remain appealing places. The flip side of this reality is that facilities that are not invested in can become obsolete and runners up in customers' thinking. To that end, no one should take for granted that the economic performance of Nationals Park is self-sustaining and otherwise guaranteed. Your bill would provide the city with a reliable and steady stream of revenue to maintain this ballpark. This funding will be secure and predictable. As you would expect, necessary maintenance and improvements to the ballpark will hasten over time as critical elements reach the end of their useful life. Necessary improvements in 2023, for example, were greater than the previous 15 years combined. And as the ballpark ages, this trend will hasten. It's quite artful that the revenue streams you've identified in your bill are funds generated at the ballpark itself, which in effect becomes a self-sustaining ballpark. From the Nationals' perspective, this is prudent and thoughtful and ensures that maintenance of the ballpark never becomes a general fund issue. It may seem just a short time ago that Nationals Park had its first home opener, as Councilmember Allen alluded to. That game featured a walk-off home run by a rookie named Ryan Zimmerman. 16 years later, Ryan is retired from playing active baseball, but thankfully is still associated with our team. And 16 years later, this ballpark is entering advanced middle age. No comparison to Mr. Zimmerman, of course. And 16 years later, the city's endeavor to attract a professional baseball club and build a ballpark seems like it's been validated over and over. The team looks forward to working with the council and the executive and events DC to ensure that the ballpark continues to fulfill that original vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. Betsy Philpott?
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Mendelson. I'm just here to answer questions if you have any. Thank you.
And of the three of you at the table, I think you're the only one who hasn't spent some time in this building. So I hope you're enjoying some of the excitement.
Yes, thank you. I did get to see a tour of Mr. McCarthy's former office.
That was not the excitement I was alluding to. Mr. Monime, your testimony spoke really to the economic benefits to the neighborhood surrounding the stadium. Do you have any comments on the bill itself?
Not in particular. I think that, from my time working in public finance and city government, I think investing in the long-term maintenance and replenishing of capital assets is a basic tenet of running any facility. I think we deal with it on Yards Park. So in terms of the principle and structure of it, it makes a ton of sense to me. It self-funds itself. It can be sustainable, ensure that you're in front of the repairs and not trying to recapitalize something at the end of its useful life.
Now, in your statement, you also alluded to some economic study or studies that have been done. Can you say a little bit more about those?
Sure. So in 2020, we did a study of the fiscal impact of the sports and entertainment industry during and through the COVID era.
And that would be the Nationals as well as Audi Field?
Correct. And we saw its ability to provide for the neighborhood and be resilient was well documented. We updated that study just this past year where we're looking at the broader fiscal impact of both Capitol Riverfront and the Southwest Business Improvement District in terms of their contribution to the city's overall economic strength. And really the bottom line finding was it's a growing part of that contribution. For example, 2% of the landmass of the District of Columbia is made up of those two business improvement districts, yet it provides almost 10% of the net revenues to the city. So, and this is still growing and we're about 72% built out. Southwest is still growing. So we have the ability in these two neighborhoods that sit right on the Anacostia River and partnering really closely with the Anacostia bit on the other side to see a tremendous growth in terms of tax revenue to support the city, particularly in this moment of time where we're rethinking downtown and what it's going to be over the next 10 years. So I think that this bill really consistent with making sure that your strengths remain strong while you're retooling. I think this investment in the stadium is very, very much aligned with that thinking.
And when you speak of, I think you said 10% of the revenue to the city, that's not just business revenue, but residential like income tax.
That's right. It's comprehensive. I mean, I think one of the things that the city did in its wisdom is it not only put entertainment assets here in this neighborhood, they built tons of residential office space. And so what we see because of the draw to the water is we have residents moving in. I said almost 22,000 residents from less than 2,000 back in 2003. So we've seen tremendous growth in the neighborhood, both from an income perspective, from sales tax perspective, property taxes has increased as properties become more valuable in that location. And I think it's part and parcel of that first catalytic investment in Nationals Ballpark back in 2007, 2008.
Let me ask a couple of questions of the Nationals representatives. Are there any major repairs necessary right now to the ballpark that are not taking place? Microphone.
Thank you, Chairman. We have a great relationship with our landlord, Events DC, and we were able to negotiate funds for the major repairs that we needed last year. So while there's always going to be some repairs going forward, to answer your question, no, at this point, there's not a major one, right in front of us, but we anticipate that there will be a lot of needs over the next 15 years.
When you say major repairs last year, what were they?
The two main ones were our new stadium lights, which are necessary for the functioning of the ballpark, as well as the scoreboard.
So both of those are being taken care of.
Correct.
With regard to the lights, was that an issue with the league?
There are parameters that the league sets forth regarding what lights we need, but they needed to be replaced at that point.
What I'm looking for is whether the league was saying, hey, you need to get your lights going or you're gonna not be able to have games.
Yes, we were one of the few stadiums in the United States that didn't have the same lights as other stadiums, and the league was putting pressure on us to get our lights up to standard.
It's also worth noting the lights that were replaced were incandescent light bulbs from technology of 20 years ago. I believe the city has been aggressive in street lights and elsewhere of replacing it with LED lighting, which is obviously more green and sustainable. So that improvement also allowed us to do that.
Yeah, well, we like green, but where I was going was whether some of these repairs actually jeopardize, that might be too strong a word, but jeopardize what Major League Baseball, what the league requires of you all.
Yes, you're correct, Chairman. We have to have lights of a certain standard in order to play our games, in order to have a safe operational stadium for the players to play under those lights.
It's also worth noting, I think last September over the Labor Day weekend, the scoreboard actually got to a place where it overheated because of the extreme heat wave and was basically not visible in the ballpark. And so there was every reason to believe that the scoreboard was not going to last until this season. So that repair, while made, was just made in the nick of time. And as you and Councilmember Allen alluded, that's obviously not how you want to do major capital repairs. So and as I said in my testimony, it's like any residential property. When you own a home, very few things break or need to be replaced in the first few years. But as your house ages over time, major systems begin to reach the end of their useful life. And so I think we're at that time now with the ballpark in the second half of our lease, where most things are going to need to be replaced at some point. And so it's just weighted towards the end of our lease time, which is where we are now.
Now, I want to ask you about relationship with Events DC, but I'm not looking for answer like, oh, things are wonderful or things are horrible there. But Events DC is the landlord. I mean, the district is the landlord, but Events DC is who manages it. There've been some issues in the past. Does it look like with this legislation that going forward, there will be less question about what kind of expenses can be covered with this money?
I think one would hope so. And I think, like any landlord-tenant relationship, occasionally there are differences. I will say that during the past year, working with Events DC, we've accomplished a lot. My colleague Betsy has alluded to the lights and the scoreboard replacement. But I think just is in the case of any agency looking at funding, if they know that there's a secure stream of revenue coming, it's going to be more easy for them to plan ahead and do the repairs in a timely fashion. And it's our hope that your legislation would do that and make it easier for them to do exactly that.
Now, there've been some terms in the lease as negotiated back in 2007 or thereabouts that were not as precise as they needed to be. Has that been remedied, or do we need to address that in this legislation?
We don't feel that we need to address that in this legislation, but we are continuing to work with Events DC to find a amicable solution.
Amicable solution includes amicable definitions or understanding what the terms mean.
Well, we touched on it a little earlier too. There's some concepts from 15 years ago that don't take into account technology, for example. And so we just need to work together to find a solution that works for both of us, but this legislation doesn't have any bearing on that process.
All right, and you're optimistic about that all being worked out amicably,
Yes, very much so.
Yes.
but it's not completely worked out at this point.
No, but we are in active conversations.
Now, with regard to the bill specifically, are there any changes that you think need to be made?
No, sir.
No, sir.
I mean, we got it right. It's perfect the way it was introduced.
Very thoughtful. As I said in my testimony, I think there were several revenue streams that go into the ballpark revenue fund, but you've taken the two that are actually generated at the ballpark, the taxes on food and tickets and merchandise, as well as our annual lease payment to the city. So it seems very thoughtful and very artful that those would actually be turned back in to a fund to sustain the ballpark. And it really has no impact on the general fund or other services that the city provides. So we think that's a very artful way of doing this.
And that revenue appears to be sufficient over time.
It's hard to tell. I mean, it's hard to predict what costs are going to be. And we know what other clubs have done. There was a third-party study done about necessary improvements that other ballparks have done. And so we know in the long run what that figure might be. This bill would come close to it, but it's hard to predict 15 years out, but it's a good start for sure.
Let me turn to my colleagues. Councilmember Allen, if you have questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks everybody for your testimony. A couple of quick things. In my opening, I talked about the fact that I think if we look at other experiences that we don't want to repeat, we have to be able to be making investments in that maintenance. And you talked about, replacing the lights, replacing the scoreboard, but you also talked about them being essentially at a point of risk of failure, right? That the scoreboard was at a point of failure. The lights were at a point of failure. Right? And my understanding is actually a whole bunch of the lights were actually out. And correct me if I'm wrong, that they couldn't even be replaced because some of the manufacturing elements don't even exist anymore. That doesn't sound like routine maintenance to me. And so I know that as the tenant, especially in a setting like this, we're going to put the best face forward on making sure we're working with the landlord. But I just want to make sure I understand, are those two repairs that were they made as part of just routine maintenance, or were they made as we're getting close to a point of failure and we absolutely have to replace these things?
Hi, Councilmember Allen. This is Betsy Philpott from the Washington Nationals. Those were made as part of the process that's set forth in the lease, which is an annual process that we go through with Events DC every year. And there's some items that take longer to replace. So mainly to answer your question, this is something that is routine on an annual basis. But obviously some items there's going to be more discussion between the landlord and the tenant, and it's good to have that tension, obviously. So, we think that the process that's in place within the lease would guide here and make sure that in the future, we wouldn't have as many items reaching that critical point of failure, especially if this bill passes.
Yeah. Let's talk about the lights. Did we have 100% functioning lights last season?
No, we did not.
Did we have the ability to even replace some of the lights that had gone out?
We did not. A lot of that equipment had become obsolete.
Right. And thank you. I mean, to try to help us all think about it from like our home, right? If I know my hot water heater is starting to fail, but it hasn't actually failed yet, right? It's kind of human nature. I'm probably going to wait and put that off just a little bit longer to make that repair. But the moment I'm going through a week's worth of cold showers, I'm probably going to get that hot water heater replaced, right? And so I think I might have had a routine process by which I replaced my hot water heater, but I wasn't doing the maintenance that was necessary to make sure I had all my pieces functioning. And I think that's, while I hear certainly the desire to have that constructive relationship and there's a process to kind of get these things repaired, I just want it to be very clear. The repairs that are being made were 100% needed and necessary, but they also were at essentially a point of critical failure. And so I just think that's really important that we realize that's what we're talking about, is these investments need to be made a little bit earlier, and we've got to have the resources to do so. So with this legislation, how does this legislation make it so that decision point can be made a little bit easier? What in this changes the dynamic around a decision point being made, or does it at all?
Well, as I said earlier to Chairman Mendelson, I think any landlord would benefit from a reliable, predictable stream of funds, knowing that that can be matched against the needs of the ballpark. We have a study that shows, performed by a third party, based on the useful life of other systems in similar ballparks. We generally know when things are going to fail within a couple of years. So if we can marry that schedule with the income from this legislation, that will be optimal. And obviously, we would still have to do that, as Betsy said, with the annual process that we have with events DC. But one would have to think that this bill would make that process much more predictable, not just for us, but most importantly for events DC, which would not have to say, what's our own cash flow issue this year vis-a-vis other things that we have to do with our other mandates. So this would kind of take that a little bit offline and provide something that's secure and predictable.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I think also within the legislation, there's an annual reporting requirement that comes back to the mayor and the council about what the funds are being used for. And I think that probably gives us a little bit of a lens as a check on the landlord and the tenant to make sure the dollars are being spent and that we're focusing on those repairs and maintenance that we need to. I have one more question that I do want to turn to Ms. Giles for a second as well. We talk about the taxes generated from within the ballpark being able to help fund this. Is there how do you compare that to how other ballparks work? As you look at other stadiums, is this a similar model that we're seeing in other places? And I guess the second part of the question is, how much variability do we see based on, I want to sell out every time, of course, but I know that's not going to be realistic. From a ticket sales perspective, how much variability do we see between either a low attendance game or a high attendance game? And how's that going to play out from an impact and making sure these funds are available?
Well, it's worth noting our neighbors up north in Baltimore went through a process somewhat similar to this last year. Governor Moore and the legislature of Baltimore obligated about $600 million actually to renovate Camden Yards, and another $600 million to do the stadium where the Ravens play. Those bonds are actually not grounded in revenue generated at the ballpark. I think it comes out of more of a general obligation. So again, I think the way this bill is crafted is better. And we do know, as I said earlier, that our fans have lots of options. And while they're definitely watching what's happening on the field, and that's always a major factor, the physical space of the ballpark ends an aura of whether this is an attractive place to come and watch a sporting game. And we know from trying to attract concerts and other events that they have options here in the region. And if our ballpark isn't, up to par with our competitors, the bottom line will suffer and we'll sell fewer tickets. But more importantly, that'll be fewer tax revenues for the city and fewer people patronizing the restaurants and the businesses in the Capitol Riverfront. So I think it's one of those things where everybody succeeds together if the ballpark is kept up, the city and the team as well as the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Part of this bill is that it incentivizes the Nationals to prepare the stadium in the best way possible. And it incentivizes the city to have the stadium as competitive as possible, so that it draws as many events and continues to have such an impact in the area.
And it's worth noting too that in the lease, to which has been alluded several times, there are obligations that the team has, of course, to the city too, in terms of daily repair and maintenance. To date, the team has conveyed more than $100 million of direct payments to the city to use the ballpark. We spend about $150 million a year to actually maintain it in terms of day-to-day stuff and provide security and the like. So in addition to what the city needs to contribute for the ballpark that it owns, there's stuff that we do on a daily basis as well to make the ballpark actually run.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I will say, before I turn to Ms. Giles, I want to kind of lift up what Mr. Monome said as well, that, making sure that we are investing in our public spaces all around the ballpark is also crucially important. I remember working hard with my colleagues to, I got the funding in to help, make some improvements to Half Street. So that pedestrian experience walking to the ballpark or coming out is going to be important. Obviously, over the years, I've spent a lot of time and energy working around the Capitol Riverfront and the boardwalk and making sure those are inviting, exciting, wonderful, safe spaces that bring our city out there so that come enjoy a ballpark and catch a great game, but also hang out before, hang out after. And I think that creates a lot of the economic activity. So the city needs to make sure they're doing their part in those investments. Mr. Giles, I just want to make sure before my time runs out, because I want to make sure I understood a little bit of more what you were saying. Did I hear you saying you're recommending in addition to this legislation, something around creating some type of stronger work or pipeline kind of partnership to help? I just want to give you some time to help explain a little bit more what you were thinking about or what you're advocating for here.
No, I appreciate that, Councilmember Allen. We're definitely advocating for a community benefit to come out of this legislation to make sure that the revenue that's generated from the ballpark also goes to employment programs that our students can participate in. At the end of the day, the ballpark is located in Ward 8, and we know that we want to see better outcomes for our students and DC residents who live and work in Ward 8 and across the city. So we just want to make sure that, the ballpark is well maintained, but we're also not ignoring an opportunity to ensure that there's a strong workforce partnership.
Got it. I appreciate that. I think,
do you mind if I just address something what Ms. Giles just said?
Yeah, 1 second, I'll do that. One is I just want to say my experience has been that there are some community partnerships that exist with the Nationals in terms of, I know the ballpark now sits in Ward 8 for a very long time. It sat in Ward 6 and it's kind of right on the border. So I know from a community partnership standpoint, as the Ward 6 council member, I always saw the Nationals building out relationships within the community around it. I'd certainly be open to how do we continue to strengthen that? How do we continue to support that? And especially with workforce opportunities. So I'm definitely open to kind of thinking that through. And then I was going to say, Mr. McCarthy, if you wanted to address that or touch on that point, if with your discretion, Mr. Chairman, with a little extra time.
Thank you. Ms. Giles, thank you very much for your testimony and also thank you for being a fan. As you probably know, in Ward 7, the Nationals have a 9-acre baseball academy, which takes about 200 kids and their families through a great process every year. Last year was, I think, the first year where the first 8th grade cohort became a freshman in college. And we have people who've been through our baseball academy that are now about to enter college or in college, about to enter the professional world. And we think a lot of them are actually going to generate to careers in sports. We also have a program called Nats Prep, where the 5 career academies in the DC public high schools each send students once a month to the ballpark to experience one or more different sections in the ballpark. Revenue and analytics, sales, marketing, communications. And we're kind of inculcating in those kids an idea that you don't have to be a ball player to work at a ball club. There are lots of careers. Last month, actually, the chancellor brought 50 students to Nationals Park for Career Day. And we had him there along with the students who walked the floors of our ballpark, met our staff, and learned about what careers in professional sports are like. I'd love to talk to you, Ms. Giles, about that program and hear what other ideas you have, but we do have some great programs already connecting the sporting world to kids in their careers.
Yeah, and I appreciate the programs that you have, that you've made available. I would say that, what I'm talking about is employment. So we want to see that, our students and those who are graduating from DC public schools, public charter schools, have, opportunity to be employed and have really great careers that can help them take care of themselves and their families. So I definitely would love to talk more about, ways to expand, the offerings that you already have.
Look forward to that.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilmember Bonds.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you all for being here. And I want to say first, thank you very much for your charitable activities. I'm very much aware of it. Have been to the ballpark that you just described and haven't seen a game there, but I've seen some of the practicing from time to time. And I know that Ward 7 is continues to be happy about that. I always talk about Ward 7, my home ward, so to speak. But I wanted to just, if we could, I want to understand two things. One, as you're thinking about the next 5 years, what do you see in the way of major repairs that will be needed?
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Some of the major repairs that we anticipate in the next 5 years would be in connection to our HVAC systems, as well as our vertical transportation systems, such as the elevators and the escalators that are all throughout the ballpark. It's also, I would say it's also hard to predict every single item that we need, but we know that those are two major ones that are coming up.
Thank you. I know that they're also expensive. And as a community, we pride ourselves on thinking that we are on target with workforce development. But you are saying to us an area that we do not yet have an apprentice program is elevator repair. So we really have to zero in on that very quickly. Seriously, because think of all the buildings and think of what that could mean for so many of our small companies, giving them an opportunity. So maybe they'll come over and do some practice on your elevators, sincerely.
Okay.
The other area I'm most interested in is understanding the finances. And I know I may want to talk about this to some degree, but when we talk about the ballpark fund, it does not capture all of the resources that are a part of your enterprise. Am I correct?
Well, Councilmember Bonds, let me tell you what I think you're asking, and please tell me if I got it off. So the current ballpark revenue fund, which pays off the bonds, has a number of streams of revenue. That includes all of the taxes earned on site at the ballpark, food, merchandise, tickets. It also includes our annual lease payment. So it does not include all the revenue earned outside the ballpark by the businesses that Emeka Moname has alluded to, the restaurants, the hotels, the retail. All of that goes to the general fund.
Correct.
And that would remain unaffected. So those two streams, the taxes on site and the lease payment, would go into this new fund for maintenance and repair of the ballpark.
All right. And so this new fund, exclusive to what happens on the footprint of the ballpark, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And so of that income, what portion are you thinking would be used for repairs? What percentage? Because I know you don't want to talk dollars and cents. So
Well, it's
percentage.
Based on the studies that we've seen done by third parties about the evolution of other ballparks, we're pretty confident that the totality of the funds could be spent on that. So there would not, in effect, at the end of the period, be leftover money as we see it. Obviously, we'd have to look at things annually, and if our elevators are miraculously the only elevators in the country that last 30 years, amen, we wouldn't replace them. But based on what we know as the useful life of other systems and other places, we think we would spend the totality, the city would spend the totality of the proceeds.
All right, that's what I was trying to understand, and that's what I'm thinking would happen. And so then I say, so what does the ballpark itself, which is a business in that community, really give back to the city? Because you're going to now take the tax dollars and you're going to utilize them in making the premises or improving the premises. So what do we get back? And I was here when we had the strong battle to even get the stadium.
ma'am.
Okay,
Councilmember, I would offer one slight correction maybe to what you said.
okay,
It's not we, it's the city. So in other words, we're not responsible for as the tenant, as the lessor, we're not actually responsible for these obligations. So these are obligations that the city has on itself in the lease. So in terms of what we're giving back, as I mentioned before, we spend probably a similar amount just to run the ballpark, but there is the incredible economic spinoff outside the ballpark, which, other ballparks, have captured in other cities for itself. In this instance, that economic activity actually goes to the general fund, which is great. And so all of the proceeds for this revenue fund, but for baseball, would not be there at all. So and the give back is the economic activity of tourism and extra hotel spaces and people coming in from Virginia, for example, who might be spending their entertainment dollars elsewhere, but instead they're spending it in the district. And when they have lunch or dinner outside the ballpark at a restaurant, that's general fund money.
I asked you because I really needed you to put that example on the record. Even today, we hear individuals who feel, oh, the ballpark is a bad deal. Why did you spend taxpayers' dollars to make it a reality? And it's about what a huge entertainment vessel contains and does to grow a community.
Yes, ma'am.
And that's what we really need to remember that. So thank you very much. I knew you would do it. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. I have a couple of follow-up questions. Ms. Giles, you'll reach out to Mr. McCarthy and have more conversation with regard to some of your ideas?
Yes, I would love to.
And I think Mr. McCarthy said yes.
Sounds good.
And the other question I have is, I sort of touched on this earlier and Councilmember Bonds sort of touched on this. What large-scale repairs or renovations can be expected over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, in the next 5 years, we anticipate that the vertical transportation systems and the HVAC systems will need to be completely replaced. There's a lot of other maintenance to the steel structure of the ballpark that will need to be addressed in the next 10 years. Anything else notable?
I think we know that in other ballparks, 15 and 20-year window is when seats need to be
Yes,
replaced.
seats.
We're looking at our seats and at that carefully. I think they're okay today, but the useful life of seats is about maximum 20 years. So that's something we've got 3 more seasons to continue to monitor.
When you say, I've never heard this term before, vertical transportation systems, is that elevators and escalators?
That is
Yes.
correct, Chairman.
Okay, and I think you touched on this, Mr. McCarthy, that could account for the roughly $350 million estimate that you mentioned in your statement?
We think that's a reasonable figure of what it might be required until the end of the lease. Absolutely.
Let me just double check. Councilmember Bonds or Councilmember Allen, do you have any other questions before I excuse the witnesses? Councilmember Bonds?
Thank you very much. Just out of curiosity, how wedded are we to the lease?
I'm sorry?
How wedded are we to the lease? Are we thinking that in the year 2030, we might discover some far off dream plan that we might want to implement and it be away from the ballpark?
You mean like moving to Potomac area?
Well, kind of, yes.
Our lease is through, I believe, February 2039. And that is fact, and no one is thinking
Okay,
anything beyond that. So I
okay.
hope that answers your question.
You're not thinking about the Children's Island or some magical place still in the district.
Maybe in my
but-
personal dreams I am, but in terms of the ballpark, I think we're committed to the lease that we inherited and signed, and look forward to working with the city to maintain the ballpark in tip-top shape.
All right.
Councilmember Bonds, if I could add to that, I do think that this does create an opportunity for the council and the city to think about, well, what other investments, improvements can we make in this district to ensure that our professional sports teams are not thinking about other locations? I think we've just learned a little bit about hearing from our tenants ahead of time and maybe missing opportunity to get in front of some of those issues. I'd love to talk about what other investments can we make in Capitol Riverfront to make sure that that neighborhood, that part of the city remains the only place a professional sports team or other entertainment and sports venues want to come to in the district. Because I think it has a lot of the qualities there. But I think that's the right way to kind of think strategically about what we can do in the future.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, but you open the door, and the door you open makes me wonder, what would it be like if this ballpark fund became the sports fund and all of the necessary funding is in this conglomerate of agency that would really help to deliver what we need, repair what we need? Just a thought.
Oh.
Mr. Finance.
Okay, well, what I would say is that I think the principle that was discussed about revenues being produced for one asset probably doesn't cover, if you start to include Audi Field, I'd say the public parks and public realm that we talked about, it's not a one-to-one. Those things are in the public realm, funded out of the general fund today. Some are privately owned, maybe a little bit more complicated, but I think the idea of thinking about how do we pay for those improvements in the public realm, I think that's the conversation. I think lots of permutations as to what that could be.
Yeah, and that's where I was going. You kind of opened that door, and I was wondering, we tend to create so many enterprises or vessels for doing business, and sometimes it's easier for the public to know this is the bank, or this is the lending, or this is the enterprise that is handling this kind of service. People don't always think about the many different names that we give to the activities that we do. They just know there's housing, there's food, amenities, economic development, there's the sports. They do not think Audi, this, that, what. So just a thought.
Well, that makes me want to revisit the question, Mr. McCarthy, you had in your statement $350 million as a possible, might help if I look specifically at it. Yeah, and the question is whether the revenue generated from the site is adequate. You think so? It might not be enough, which is also a way of saying that it probably is not sufficient to support other activities outside of the stadium itself.
Yes, as you look at it that way, Mr. Chairman, I think that's 100% accurate. Yes, yes, sir.
I have no other questions for you all. Thank you very much for your testimony. I do want to note, we did ask the executive if they would participate. We always ask the executive if they will participate in our hearings because we want to hear their testimony. And the events DC as well as the mayor's office declined, which in my view was a green light on this legislation. So we're going to work on this legislation. I neglected to say this at the beginning of the hearing. The record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. That is, it will close at 5 p.m. on Tuesday, March 26th. Anybody who wishes to testify for the record, including Events DC, has 2 weeks to do so. Thank you, each of you, for your testimony. Thank you, Ms. Giles. Ms. Childs, you do not get a gold star because you were not present in the chamber and you missed the excitement. The time is 12:50 PM. This hearing is adjourned.
Council.
I did not say. I'm calling to order this hearing. This is a public hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. Today is Tuesday, March 12th, 2024. The time is 12:58 in the afternoon. And this hearing is being conducted in the Council Chambers, Room 500 of the Johnny Wilson Building. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chair of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole, and the subject of this hearing is Bill 25-669, entitled the Uniform Unlawful Restrictions in Land Records Act of 2024. This legislation was introduced by me at the request of the Uniform Law Commission on January 12th of this year. And this legislation, the stated purpose of this legislation is to enact the Uniform Unlawful Restrictions in Land Records Act, which would allow homeowners to remove unlawful restrictive covenants from the deeds to their homes, and for condominiums and other homeowner associations to remove unlawful restrictive covenants from their governing documents. It would also permit a homeowner or multifamily association to fill out an amendment form and record the amendment to the property title to effectively remove the unlawful restriction. This bill is similar to Bill 25-482, addressing restrictive covenants in land records. However, Bill 25-669 was developed by the Uniform Law Commission, and if enacted, would be consistent with the law in other states that adopt the uniform law. I will say a little bit more about this. The Committee of the Whole held a hearing on 3 bills, one of which I just alluded to, Bill 25-482. All 3 of the bills deal with the issue of restrictive covenants. I don't have the bill numbers in front of me, but one of them was restrictive covenants prohibiting multifamily housing in Chevy Chase. No, it was specifically on the site of the Library and Recreation Center in Chevy Chase on Connecticut Avenue. The second had to do with restrictive covenants similar to that, multifamily properties in what's called Rock Creek West, which I guess is essentially Ward 3 and part of Ward 4 west of Rock Creek Park. And then the third bill, which is Bill 25-482, spoke more broadly to unlawful restrictive covenants in the city. An example of a restrictive covenant, it would be a racial covenant that would say that the property could not be sold to or owned by an African-American. It could be a religious covenant in the sense of, or meaning property could not be sold to or owned by a Jew. I'm trying to think, there are some other examples of, there are other forms of restrictive covenants, and that's what this legislation, the 3 previous bills, as well as this bill today, deal with. I thought it'd be useful to have this hearing on the uniform law and see what it has that the other bills don't have and why this is the better approach to take. With that, what I'm going to do is call the first 3 witnesses: Ed Hanlon, Cheryl Barnes, and Doug Coggins. Doug Coggins is a member of the DC Land Title Association. And then I will, following that, have Brian Flowers and Jim McKay, who are with the Uniform Law Commission. So is Ed Hanlon here? Cheryl Barnes here? And Doug Coggins, who I believe are both online. So Ms. Barnes, you are first.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Cheryl Barnes, speaking on behalf of Chevy Chase Voice supporters, 1,375 of them and counting. On March 6th, I sent a letter to Chair Mendelson asking how this bill accomplishes anything that the 1972 injunction hasn't already done, U.S. District Court, Myers versus Ridley. This appellate decision voided all racial covenants in D.C. and forbade the recorder of deeds from accepting for filing in land records any deed with a racial covenant. No deed has been recorded with a racial covenant in D.C. in more than 50 years. In 1972, the D.C. Recorder of Deeds pursuant to this injunction was ordered to affix a stamp to every libra containing deeds with unlawful racial covenants so that every future recorder would be alerted and that henceforth no deed would be recorded with any unlawful covenant language. In view of the unenforceable status of these impermissible restrictive covenants, it is not clear to us that this bill will have any practical effect. However, Chevy Chase Voice supports your efforts to bring DC statutes in line with uniform state laws. Under the 1968 Fair Housing Act, all discriminatory provisions listed in your bill are illegal and unenforceable. Has any DC employee found a deed recorded since 1972 with unenforceable prohibited restrictions? Chair Mendelson's notice of the public hearing on this bill states that it is similar to Councilmember Fruman's proposed bill 25-482, but doesn't specify the respects in which it is similar and different. Councilmember Fruman's bill purports to address impermissible racial and ethnic covenants, but also has an undefined criterion. The introduction to Fruman's bill states, this legislation would affirm that deed covenants or other restrictions that interfere with the use or occupancy of real property on the basis of demographic traits, including race, color, religion, national origin, and more, are unlawful and void. The "and more" language is imprecise as to what it may include. Because Councilmember Fruman has stated in other contexts that he considers the no apartment land use restrictions to be implicitly racially restrictive, hence impermissible covenants, it is important for Chairman Mendelson's bill to state explicitly that it applies only to impermissible restrictions related to discrimination against persons and does not affect legal land use restrictions. Aside from this concern, Chevy Chase Voice favors the bill to bring DC code into conformity with uniform state laws. Councilmember Fruman recognized that his bill would matter only in the unlikely event that the Supreme Court and federal housing authorities were to rule that these impermissible restrictive covenants are legal. Given the unlikely prospect of this occurring, Chair Mendelson's bill appears to have little effect aside from harmonizing DC statutes with uniform state laws. Chevy Chase Voice's main concern is that this bill in no way promotes or enables Councilmember Fruman's bills addressing legacies and releasing restrictive covenants, which we believe are a flawed attempt at removing legal land use restrictions and are subterfuge with a spot zoning and development subtext. While we think that the definition of unlawful restriction in the Act clearly limits its effect to restrictions based on the enumerated personal characteristics, we request that it be stated clearly that the Act cannot be interpreted as addressing or affecting land use covenants. Thank you for hearing Chevy Chase Voice's concerns.
Thank you, Ms. Barnes. I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage. You seem to be reading your statement, but I don't have a copy of it. If you could provide that.
I did submit it, sir.
Oh, we'll check. Thank you. Doug Coggins.
Mr. Chairman, members of the council and staff, my name is Doug Coggins, and I appear today in my capacity as a member of the DC Land Title Association and its Policy Committee, which is a trade association comprised of real estate settlement companies, as well as title insurance agents and underwriters conducting business in the District of Columbia, to offer testimony on B 25-0669, Uniform Unlawful Restrictions in Land Records Act of 2024. When it comes to matters impacting real property in the District of Columbia, we have worked closely with the council over the years and look to continue our work with the council. We fully support the passage of Uniform Unlawful Restrictions in the Land Records Act of 2024. I agree with the previous testimony that it will harmonize the uniform laws And I do think that it is necessary from an industry standpoint for us. It's extraordinarily difficult to explain why a restrictive covenant is still existing in a deed chain when you're sitting down with somebody who doesn't understand the fact that despite Shelley v. Kramer in 1948 and the Federal Fair Housing Act 1968, that it's still in the land records. And quite simply, for people who have an opportunity to see those covenants, it's offensive. So they ought to have a mechanism to be able to deal with it so that it's essentially excised without expense to the recorder of deeds that would be prohibitive. That's my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Coggins. So you're in support of the uniform bill?
Absolutely.
And we do not have a copy of your statement. If you could provide that, please.
Absolutely, I will.
Thank you very much. And Ed Hanlon, I believe, has not shown up. So let me ask a question, Ms. Barnes. I was a little unclear the thinking behind your testimony. Is it that you're concerned and your organization, which I think you said was Chevy Chase Voices,
Yes, sir. Chevy Chase Voice.
that you or the Chevy Chase Voice is concerned that this legislation, the uniform bill, would affect the existing land use covenants, which I think has to do with multifamily housing?
I think our concern is that it in no way enabled the Fruman bills to move forward, because we think that those bills are not fact-based and really flawed. This bill seems very straightforward, and I have absolutely no concerns about it if there is an assurance that it is not used in any way to promote the Fruman bills.
And so you're opposed to the three bills that Councilmember Fruman introduced?
That's correct.
All right, thank you. Let me turn to Councilmember Bonds if you have questions.
Thank you, Chairman. No, I do not have questions. I think you cleared up what I was concerned with, what Ms. Barnes might say, but I will ask her. Yes, Ms. Barnes. So are you therefore indicating that the bill that is before us today, Bill 25669, has your support?
Indeed, it does.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. I'm just checking to see if we've been joined by any witnesses. I don't see that. So I want to thank each of you, Ms. Barnes and Mr. Coggins, for your testimony. And Mr. Coggins, please again, reminder to submit your statement. I'm going to turn to the last two witnesses, Brian Flowers, who's co-chair of the drafting committee of the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws, and James McKay, who's chair of the DC Uniform Law Commission. Is Mr. Flowers participating virtually? Oh, I see him.
Yes, unfortunately I am, Mr. Chairman. I have to apologize. I'd much rather be in the chamber with you.
I give gold stars to those who are in the chamber, so no gold star for you.
No, I have multiple conflicts today.
Nice to see you, though. All right, do you want to go first and then Mr. McKay? Does that work?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
All right.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and members of the committee. Thank you for considering Bill 25669, the Uniform Unlawful Restrictions on Land Records Act of 2024, and for your long-standing support of the work of the Uniform Law Commission, both as chair of the Judiciary Committee and now as chairman of the council. I also want to acknowledge Councilmember Fruman for his work in this area, including the introduction of an earlier version of this bill, as well as two other bills that address issues related to land restrictions. As will be discussed in greater detail by my colleague and chair of our delegation, James McKay, this measure, the Uniform Act, includes language from Councilmember Fruman's bill that provides for a fee waiver for filing an amendment to deeds under the act. And I also want to make it clear that I'm not testifying in any way for or against either the Fruman bills that were previously introduced. This is solely on the Uniform Act. The Uniform Unlawful Restrictions and Land Records Act is a uniform act produced by the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws, or Uniform Law Commission, nonprofit organization formed in 1892 to draft nonpartisan model legislation in the areas of the law for which uniformity among the states is advisable. The ULC is comprised of commissioners from all 50 states, Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The District of Columbia has a long and successful history of enacting uniform acts, including the UCC, Uniform Law on Notarial Acts, and the Uniform Trust Code. This bill was considered by the drafting committee and members of the Uniform Law Commission on at least 10 occasions over the past 2 years. I was honored to serve as co-chair of the drafting committee, along with Barry Hawkins, a distinguished real estate attorney from Connecticut, who also co-chaired the joint editorial board that brought this act to the Uniform Law Commission. I would also note that this uniform law was approved earlier this year by the American Bar Association's House of Delegates as an appropriate act for the states. It's been introduced in at least 7 jurisdictions and enacted in 1. And while we were deliberating, there were many other versions of this act that were adopted across the country. Bill 25669 creates a mechanism for property owners to record an amendment that effectively removes an unlawful restriction as defined by federal and state law, and it's often referred to as a restrictive covenant or racially restrictive covenant contained in property records. From the beginning of the late 1800s to the mid 1900s, owners and developers of real property used these restrictions to limit the ownership, leasing, and occupancy of real property on the basis of race, religion, color, national origin, and other now protected personal characteristics. These restrictions furthered harmful stereotypes, encouraged discrimination, and significantly limited housing opportunities and economic mobility for people of color and other minority groups throughout the United States. Following on what Ms. Barnes testified to, in 1948, the United States Supreme Court determined that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable, and in 1968, the Fair Housing Act made it illegal to record discriminatory restrictive covenants. However, these discriminatory covenants or unlawful restrictions still linger in the property records for individual homes and common interest communities in every single state and the District of Columbia. Bill 25669 creates a path forward for states to begin addressing our country's regrettable history of discrimination in housing. So essentially, it provides a mechanism for removing these covenants from homeowners or common interest communities' chain of title. Under the process created by Bill 25669, property owners can functionally remove any unlawful restriction they encounter in their land records. To remove the restriction, single-family homeowners can fill out the sample amendment form contained within the bill and have the completed amendment recorded in the land records for their home. For district residents who own property in a condominium, co-op, or planned community, Bill 25669 allows them to request that their association's governing body remove their unlawful restriction from the governing documents. Once a unit owner has requested the removal, the governing body is empowered to seamlessly remove the unlawful restriction by amendment without having to provide advance notice or conduct a vote of the unit owners. Additionally, even when a member of the association has not requested the removal of an unlawful restriction, Bill 25669 authorizes a common interest community board to remove the restriction on its own volition without a vote from the association. So by creating a simple process to remove offensive and unlawful restrictions, the Uniform Unlawful Restrictions and Land Records Act, Bill 25669, will allow district residents to address the painful history of discrimination that lurks in their property records while still leaving the historical record intact. By preserving the historical records, Bill 25669 ensures that the history of discrimination in our country can be researched by future generations and will allow the property to be transferred or mortgaged without undermining the insurability of title. So I wanted to leave you with, or provide you with, just a glimpse of a couple of the more salient topics during our committee deliberations. And Ms. Barnes did bring some of this out, and it was definitely among the debated topics. One, there was fairly fervent opposition to redacting or destroying the historical record of evidence in these covenants. And some earlier acts provided just that the historical records would be redacted, or they'd be somehow the historical covenants would be completely physically removed. This act preserves the historical record to ensure there's no whitewashing of history, which would make it appear that this chapter of our history never happened. And the other was a strong concern that if the existence of these covenants were not addressed or removed from the chain of title, that a subsequent court could conceivably overturn the 75-year-old precedent and find that such covenants, or in DC they use petition covenants, are enforceable and valid. I think these are called zombie covenants. So that's my testimony, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your consideration and welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Flowers. Mr. McKay?
Good morning, Chairman Mendelson, Councilmember Bonds, members of the committee. I'm James McKay, Chair of the DC Uniform Law Commission, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify on this bill, the Uniform Unlawful Restrictions in Land Records Act. And I'm not going to try to duplicate too much of DC Uniform Law Commissioner Brian Flowers, who co-chaired the drafting committee. But the Uniform Act was completed only last year after a very lengthy, thorough, and inclusive process. And as Commissioner Flowers has said, through the middle of the 20th century, owners, developments of real property throughout the United States used restricted covenants on land records to limit the ownership, leasing, and occupancy of real property on the basis of race, religion, color, national origin, and other now protected personal characteristics. And these restrictions furthered harmful stereotypes, encouraged discrimination, and significantly limited housing opportunities and economic mobility for minority groups throughout the United States. Now, as several witnesses have pointed out, in Shelley v. Craver, 1948, the Supreme Court held that these restricted covenants are not enforceable in the courts. And in 1968, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which made it illegal to record these restrictive covenants. However, the covenants are still in the land records. And for individual homeowners and common interest communities in the district in every state. One example I was given by another Uniform Law Commissioner in another hearing was he was a real property lawyer, and he had a couple, an African-American couple, come to him. And they said, well, we'd like to buy this house. And this is like 1990 or so, but there's a racially restricted covenant here. Can we buy it? I mean, people don't, unless they're constitutional, unless they're legal scholars in the area, they may not know that these restricted covenants are illegal. They're there. And this uniform law is intended to address this unfortunate situation, providing a simple and effective means for property owners to remove these unlawful restrictions from their land records. And a single family homeowner can fill up a sample amendment form in the act and have it recorded with recorded deeds. And for those who own property in a condominium or cooperative, they may request association's governing body remove the unlawful restriction. And once a unit owner has requested the removal, the governing body is empowered to remove the unlawful restriction by amendment. And I want to add that the statute requires that the governing board act in good faith. And so you'd have a potential lawsuit if the governing board did not, in good faith, remove the amendment, remove the restriction by amendment. And of course, the governing body itself may remove the restriction. And this is really important. The Uniform Act preserves the chain of title and does not compromise the insurability of title for later transfers of the property. Now, the Uniform Act has broad support from the real estate industry, including the American Land Title Association. You've heard from the DC Land Title Association, but we have a letter which I'll submit for the record, I just got, from the American Land Title Association, also by the American Mortgage Bankers Association and the Property Records Industry Association and others. The joint letter supporting the uniform law, which I will provide for the record. And the reason they support it, it provides a much needed uniformity and clear guidance to recording offices. Now, even though the Uniform Act was finalized only late last year, it's already been enacted in Pennsylvania and it's been introduced in Arizona, Colorado, Missouri, Nebraska, Washington, and West Virginia. And we expect to have a number of other introductions. It's only the very first year. Now, we have examined 3 related bills that are currently before the committee, bills 25-480 and 481, which would amend the zoning act to declare antiquated covenants to certain properties in Chevy Chase and Rock Creek West invalid, and also Bill 25-482, which is more similar to this. It's the Releasing Restrictive Covenants and Deeds Act of 2023. And the first 2 bills deal with issues that are distinct from those addressed in the Uniform Act, and we take no position on them. Bill 25-482 was similar in many respects, but because of the distinct advantage of uniformity, we recommend that the language of Bill 25-669 be adopted. However, as Commissioner Flowers mentioned, there was one provision in Bill 25-482 which we looked at and thought was a good idea. It's one that provides for the waiver of recording fees and dispensing with judicial approval. We feel that this is a good add-on, and we've actually recommended that it be adopted in other enactments, and thus we recommend a new Section 8 be added after Section 7 of the bill, with the remaining sections renumbered, and it would say something like this: fees waived, no judicial approval necessary. A, the recorder of deeds shall waive any fees for a property owner for the release of a prohibited restriction from a deed or other document as described in sections 3 or 4 of this act. And the subsection B would be judicial approval is not required to release a prohibited restriction under sections 3 or 4 of this act. This does not alter the need for judicial approval otherwise required under law for any action other than the release of a prohibited restriction. Therefore, I urge the committee to report favorably on Bill 25-669, the Uniform Unlawful Restrictions and Land Records Act of 2024 with this added section. And I would be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. McKay. Mr. McKay, could you repeat again the jurisdictions? I think you said Pennsylvania has adopted it, and where's it been introduced?
Yes, in substantially the same form. Pennsylvania has adopted it. Now, it's been introduced in 6 other jurisdictions. I mean, it's been introduced in the district, but introduced in Arizona, Colorado, Missouri, Nebraska, Washington, and West Virginia. I think it's at various stages in those jurisdictions. And we do, hope to have a number of other introductions this year. Not all legislatures meet every year, one thing, but it's a process that has begun. And it's gotten a very good start. My experience for the Uniform Acts, this is a very good start for a Uniform Act to get this many introductions so quickly.
In Pennsylvania, was there any controversy around the adoption?
Well, I would have defer.
Been sending it. People should not get to work and live in our city making decisions that result in the death of tens of thousands without DC residents being able to say anything. Stand on the side of justice, not genocide.
Yeah.
Okay, and let me just note, there may be a few more of those, so, Mr. Flowers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I don't recall anything particularly controversial in Pennsylvania. There are always minor differences, but no. But I would note, since I do have the mic right now, that a lot of states adopted forms of this act before we finished our deliberations. I think there are probably easily 20, 30 states that have these mechanisms in place now. And that was one of the reasons we wanted to make sure that we got this Uniform Act in place so that there could be some measure of uniformity. And it's important, particularly for the land title administration, I'm sorry, the land title companies, and also to ensure that there's an appropriate and functional mechanism for redacting and releasing covenants throughout the country. But no, I'm not aware of anything that was particularly controversial in Pennsylvania.
Now you're mentioning that reminds me, there was some testimony earlier suggesting, or at least it got me thinking about this question. Why do we do this at all? If the restrictive covenants are unconstitutional, both under the Supreme Court ruling and then with the Federal Housing Act, why do we even need to do this?
It's just it's a mechanism for cleaning up land records. Some people are very much offended by having this in their chain of title, and there was no mechanism for removing these covenants from the chain of title. And that's really what this does. It provides a mechanism for those who want to do it. And not everyone's going to want to do it, because in our deliberations, there were certain people who wanted to ensure that, and we accommodated them in the way that we did it, but ensure that there was an historical record that demonstrated what the environment was like in this country prior to 1948.
Mr. McKay, were you going to add anything?
Well, I just add that they are in the land records. If you wanted to remove it without an act like this, you might have to pay a lawyer a lot of money to do it. Now, this makes it very simple. We have a sample form. And as I imagine what we've happened in experience before when other states have enacted similar ones, and then we come with the Uniform Act, very often they will amend their acts and adopt the Uniform Acts instead of their current act, just for uniformity. But this makes it very simple, inexpensive, and effective for a homeowner or an association to amend the land records and remove these unlawful restrictions, which are very unfortunate. I mean, that it's something that is important, and this makes it much easier for people to do it.
Mr. McCain, your testimony, you said we recommend adding provision from 25-482 for the waiver of recording fees. Sorry about that.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to repeat the question, but
Yes, you had in your statement, recommend adding a provision in Bill 25-482 for the waiver of recording fees
yes.
and dispensing with judicial approval. The Uniform Act, does it provide for the waiving of fees?
No, but that's a provision like that would not be at all inconsistent. In fact, it would complement that. And after thinking about it and talking it to the two chairs of the committee, we feel that this is a very good addition, and therefore we would, and we have recommended it for other states. Now, not every state can do this, but we would recommend that the
Do you have any sense of what the cost would be? As in, we have fiscal impact statements on bills.
I don't know. I guess I could ask Ida Williams and Bob McEwen about that. I'm not sure what the actual cost. I wouldn't think there'd be a lot.
Okay, but you don't know. And
No,
it's not part of the uniform bills, so you don't know in that regard. What about the judicial approval? Do we require in the district judicial approval for something like this?
well, I think the idea is, and I think Commissioner Flowers may elaborate, is the idea is you don't want to require, you don't want to get in a situation where judicial approval is required. I mean, I don't personally know if that subsection B is really important because I'm not sure if there's a real problem there. Maybe Commissioner Flowers can tell me if there is.
Do you know, Mr. Flowers?
I think he's frozen.
Can't quite tell if he's thinking or he's frozen. Brian Flowers?
Process, not to make it more complicated.
All right, we missed everything you said. You were frozen. Can you repeat it?
Okay. One thing that distinguishes this from some of the earlier bills that were adopted in other jurisdictions is that it includes the section that allows owners of condominiums, co-ops, and other common interest community properties to have those restrictions removed. And the choice was deliberately left to the states as to whether or not there would be a fee or a fee waiver, because that's going to differ depending on the cost in each jurisdiction. And in terms of judicial approval, the goal was to make this as simple a process as possible. And that's why, again, this is something that's specific to states, is that the types of unlawful restrictions are based on state and federal law. So the types of restrictions are going to differ from state to state. And it was thought that if the restrictions were clearly identified, there wouldn't be any need for judicial approval.
Could you repeat that last sentence?
It was thought that if the types of restrictions were clearly identified in state law, there wouldn't be a need for judicial approval.
My question was whether in DC law, we require judicial approval for removing restrictive covenants. Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know the process for doing it in the district. It would have to be some sort of a deed amendment, which normally would not require judicial approval, but it could be costly.
What about the issue of, let me see, how do I want to phrase this? Is it clear in the Uniform Act what is a restrictive covenant that could be removed? What I'm getting at is there was some testimony in your microphone.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's on now. It's on now. There was some testimony about whether this would implicate some restrictive covenants, like dealing with land use, like dealing with multifamily use.
Well, this is just aimed at restrictive covenants based on protective characteristics. It doesn't go beyond that. But again, I think Commissioner Flowers would be best to answer that. It's supposed to be simple, plain, and to the point, and not get into a lot of different other areas.
Mr. Flowers?
Yeah, this was discussed within the committee and on the floor as well. And that is whether or not restrictions which were not direct restrictions would be covered. And it wasn't, again, that was left to the state law. And here we'd be looking, I would say, to the Human Rights Act, whether or not that would be something that is clearly unlawful. And even though you try to avoid it, I mean, there may be situations in which there would be judicial review of some of these matters. I think it's just inevitable given the nature of society. For example, whether or not an apartment building would be or the prohibition on apartment buildings would be included, I think there could be a difference of opinion on that.
So the bill, the Uniform Act says defines unlawful restriction. Means a prohibition, restriction, covenant, or condition in a document that purports to interfere with or restrict the transfer, use, or occupancy of real property on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, disability, or other personal characteristics. So that would seem not to include apartment buildings, for example.
I would agree.
But it says in violation of other law of the district or federal law.
But it says and, so you have to tie it to one of these protected categories in paragraph A.
Okay.
That was not the intent, though, to include apartment buildings and that sort of thing. And I think some of that discussion should be in the comments to the Uniform Act. I don't know that you always pick up the comments or incorporate those into the laws, into the bills, but that this may be a circumstance where you'd want to do that.
Yeah, no, we try to in our community reports to reference the background materials from the Uniform Law Commission. It's one of the advantages of the Uniform Bill is there's an extensive legislative explanation of legislative intent. Let me turn to colleagues for questions. Councilmember Bonds.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Councilmember Bonds.
All right, again, thank you, Chairman. I'm trying to understand the empowers common interest communities and what are we saying? Are we saying as an individual, I live in a condominium, 16 condominiums. 3 of my neighbors and I, we want to remove the covenant from our deed. And the rest of the members do not. So what do we do?
We made a deliberate choice in the Uniform Act that a single individual could either file the amendment or could petition the governing board to remove an unlawful restriction. Some of the early adopted acts, and I think this was one of the distinctions perhaps in Pennsylvania, is that you had to have all the owners, all joint owners agreed to remove their restriction. But for the Uniform Act, we felt the best course was that a single individual would be able to do it because these are already unlawful restrictions, they're unenforceable. So we didn't want to make it any more difficult for this process to occur. But yes, a single individual in a condominium unit could petition the board, and if the board makes a determination that it is an unlawful restriction, then they have to remove that restriction within 90 days.
All right, and when you say a single individual can petition the board, which board are you speaking of?
The condo board, the governing board.
And let's say the condo board says no. That would put the matter before the courts, correct?
I think that is correct.
Yes, I think so.
And okay, so we're now before the courts. And let's say that there is the courts side with the, what do you call it, the plaintiff? And would this then set a precedent for any other matters that a owner of a condominium could, or co-op could take into court if they did not like the ruling of the condominium board?
Well, if one thing, I mean, a trial court's opinion has no precedential effect on other transactions throughout the city. It would have to be a published decision by the DC Court of Appeals. But I would think that it'd be unlikely you'd have too much of a dispute about there. If you have the unusual situation where you've got a clearly restrictive covenant and you've got a member of the a unit owner has asked to be removed and the board says, no, we're not going to, we don't want to, then I would think that the unit owner could go to court and get injunctive relief, get a either declaratory order or injunction requiring the board to, it's almost like mandamus, you know, you're asking the board to do its duty or to remove the covenant and so that the land records are in compliance with federal law. And but we hopefully don't think we'll ever get a situation like that, but you never know.
Well, that's why I'm asking, because I'm thinking again about one of the public witnesses and their concerns about some of the other bills that try to address this issue, and feeling that, well, I think they used the terminology that these other bills were flawed. And so I just want to have an understanding of what this means for a condo owner. You also include in common interest communities, homeowners association members. The district government does have a say as it relates to condos, but it has no rules on the books that speak to homeowner association. So can we move into this realm?
Well, I would think Commissioner Flowers might be better to answer that. I think that the point is that we want to allow the mechanism. The mechanism is that the unit owner asks the board has to, in good faith, consider the request. Now, so we have to obviously look at the board's, what the request was and what the board's action was. But perhaps Commissioner Flowers can give you more details.
No, I'm really not sure because it's going to depend on the nature of the association. I think it's just going to depend. I mean, we think that it's broad enough to cover most forms of common ownership, but maybe that it's not. We think it is. It was intended to track the Common Interest Ownership Act, Uniform Act, and all the forms of ownership covered in that bill, or that act, I'm sorry, in that legislation.
All right, well, I hear you. I was just wondering how it might be applied. Having worked with some of the condominium associations, I know that their deliberations are not always as any member would like it to be. I'll leave it at that. And so it's very curious as to how this would really affect owners. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. I do not have any other questions for you. You look like. Thank you, Mr. McKay. Were you going to say anything else?
No, well, I just wanted to thank you for having this hearing, and we wanted to offer, we will work with the committee to work on any tweaks that are necessary in this legislation. And I think the Uniform Act is the best approach. Perhaps the fee waiver is something that we might want to add, but I thank you very much and Councilmember Bonds and Chairman Mendelson for your consideration of this Uniform Act.
Thank you, Mr. McKay. Thank you, Mr. Flowers, and thank you to the early.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That's going to conclude this hearing. The record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. That is, it will close at 5 p.m. on March 26th. So anyone who wishes to submit comments for the record has 2 weeks to do so. The time is now 1:47 PM and this hearing is adjourned.